Assalamualaikum. This book is considered a seminal work for anyone who wants to know how the slave trade was constructed, financed, and eventually dismantled. The author tracks the trade from its 15th century Portuguese origin to its 19th century conclusion. He explores the European boardrooms and palaces where the trade was treated as a mundane but lucrative commercial venture. It spans the African coast, the Middle Passage, and the New World, showing how integrated the trade was into the economy. The trade required a vast network of cooperation between European traders and African leaders. This book is said to be the most comprehensive one-volume history of the slave trade. If you want to understand how the profit from sugar and tobacco literally built modern Europe and the Americas, this book explains the ledger sheets. The final third of the book provides a fascinating look at how a practice that was considered natural for centuries was eventually deemed a stain on humanity through the efforts of early activists. This book was published in 1997. It is dense, names-heavy, and rather dry. It is not a narrative history in the breezy style of modern bestsellers. Some critics argue it focuses too much on the traders and politicians and not enough on the lived agency and resistance of the enslaved people. The author discusses numbers, how many people were on which ship, from which port, in which year. While the numbers are important, it can be tedious for a casual reader. What I did not expect to learn from this book is the involvement of African monarchs and nobility in the slave trade. It provides an extensive detail on the African side of the trade. It challenges the raid myth, i.e. the idea that Europeans simply landed and kidnapped people at will. Instead, it shows that the trade was often a highly organized, state-sanctioned commercial relationship. It illustrates that leaders like the Oba of Benin or the kings of Dahomey were often in a position of strength, setting the terms of trade, taxing the Europeans, and demanding specific luxury goods in exchange for captives. There is a significant amount of discussion about the kingdom of Dahomey, i.e. modern-day Benin, which became a garrison state. Leaders like King Agaja initially seemed to oppose the trade, but eventually the kingdom's economy became so dependent on the export of captives, who were often prisoners of war, that it became one of the most organized slave exporting powers on the slave coast. The author portrays Queen Nzinga of Ndongo and Matamba as a brilliant diplomat and military leader in what is now Angola. She spent decades fighting against Portuguese encroachment. While she is often remembered as a resistance hero, she frequently used the slave trade as a political tool, sometimes selling captives to the Dutch to weaken her Portuguese enemies. The focus on African leaders is intended to show the global scale of the industry. The author argues that the trade was a joint enterprise. He details how internal African warfare, the expansion of empires like Asante or Oyo, and the demand for European technology created a cycle where leaders felt they had to participate in the trade to acquire firearms to protect themselves from being enslaved by their neighbors. These chapters are quite eye-opening. They move the story away from being a purely Western history and turn it into a complex, multi-continental political drama. It explains how the trade did not just hurt Africa, it fundamentally reshaped the continent's political border and power structures for centuries. The moral dilemmas presented in this book are particularly haunting because the author approaches them not just as abstract philosophy, but as a series of calculated choices made by individuals across 3 continents. The dilemma often was not, is this right or wrong? But rather, What am I willing to ignore to maintain my power or wealth? For many African monarchs, the dilemma was a security paradox. To defend their kingdom, they needed firearms. To get firearms from Europeans, they had to trade captives. If a king refused to participate, his neighbors, who did trade for guns, would eventually conquer his people and sell them into the trade anyway. King Alfonso wrote to the Portuguese king pleading for a stop to the trade, but realized that his own nobility was becoming so addicted to European luxury goods that they would likely overthrow him if he cut off the supply. He was forced to choose between the integrity of his people and the stability of his throne. For centuries, European powers faced a massive contradiction: how to reconcile a religion of brotherly love with a trade in human flesh. The most common moral escape hatch was the idea of rescue. Theologians argued that by purchasing Africans, they were rescuing them from paganism and giving them a chance at eternal salvation through Christianity. Many relied on the just war theory, the belief that if a person was captured in a legit war, it was legal to sell them. Traders often chose not to ask questions about how just the wars actually were. By the 1700s, the slave trade was no longer a fringe business. It was the engine of Europe and America's economy. Many British and French politicians believed that if they abolished the trade, rival nations would simply take over their share, leaving their own country bankrupt, while the trade continued unabated. Even those who hated the trade faced a moral quandary. When Britain finally moved toward abolition, the government faced a choice. Should they compensate the enslaved people for their suffering, or the slave owners for loss of property? In a final moral irony, the British government paid £20 million, roughly 40% of the national budget at the time, to the owners, while the formerly enslaved received nothing. This was seen as a pragmatic moral compromise to ensure the law passed without a civil war. This book is about 900 pages. Read it if you want a definitive reference work and you are interested in the economics and politics of the era. Skip this book if you prefer an emotional, character-driven narrative, or you prefer a focus on the cultural life and resistance of the enslaved people. You can get this book using the link below. There is also a link to a related video. If you like listening to me babbling about books, please subscribe and turn on notification. Thank you.